Okay, thank you. And thank you for coming, and thanks to the Institute for bringing Ali here and hosting this talk. It's a real pleasure to have Ali Pinar visiting this afternoon. Ali is a computer scientist who has done an amazingly wide range of things in scientific computing and combinatorial scientific computing, which I will not tell you all about, except to say that he's actually done a lot of work in sort of structural graph analytics, and he's one of the authors of the best random graph test case generator that I know of. If you're looking for random graphs to test your algorithms, I recommend that you talk to him about Pinar. Anyway, Ali did his PhD work at the University of Illinois and was on the research staff at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory for several years before he moved to Sandia in Livermore, where he's now a principal member of the research staff. And he's going to talk to us today about combinatorial approach to vulnerability analysis of the power grid.
Well, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a great opportunity to be here. And I don't know if he remembers, but when John was inviting me, he just put a little blurb, especially your work about how you drive the graph models. And that's why I had to emphasize the combinatorial approach to vulnerability analysis. And this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. Like, essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And if you work on any real problem, any engineering or science problem, all models are wrong, and you know that. And well, the key is finding something useful. And the major theme or the message of the talk will be very simple. Graph models are useful. And if I can convince you about that at the end of the talk, I'll be done my job. This is as simple as this. Graph models are useful. All right, so the specific problem is the power blackouts. So these are the pictures. I'm sure you've seen them. So this is the pointer. Okay. So these are the pictures from the Northeast blackout in 2003. And actually, I became interested in this problem after the blackout. And I was looking at the TV, and I was fresh PhD at the time, you know, at the stage where you know everything, you know. I was so confident. I looked at the TV, and my plan was, hey, well, I will tell the power engineers what they should have done to avoid this blackout and move on, solve their problem, and move on to real problems. Well, it's been, I don't know, 11 years now since then. I'm still working on it. You know? It's been a humbling experience. Well, the problem was more complicated than I thought, but of course, well, we're making progress. So I think that's the good part. So the thing is, blackouts, they do happen. I would say the power is resilient. It's not, well, very vulnerable. It's quite resilient, but given the size of the system and its importance, well, the blackouts do happen. And how do we avoid them? So if you talk to power engineers, they talk about n minus k security, and that means if my system has n components, choose any k components of it. If I lose any k out of these n, the system should be able to survive, and it should stay intact. And that's what they mean by n minus k security. But the problem is that in practice, k is 1. So the system should stay intact if you lose one component. But, well, you need a little bit more than that. And the Northeast blackout, actually, depending on how you count it, I would say 3. It started with 3 broken lines. Actually, the system did what. So it survived the first one, but well, if you lose 3 lines, there will be huge blackouts. So how do we, well, enforce this? How do we improve the security? And also, when you talk to power engineers, one of the problems is enforceable standards. So if I want the system to be n minus 2 secure, and people tell me, hey, here's the way I'm operating. How can I ensure that the system is n minus 2 secure? So I need to be able to say, detect if there is any vulnerability in the system that would, well, cause a problem after a removal of 2 lines. I should be able to detect it. And that's a difficult problem by itself. How do I find this? If I want to increase k, I should be able to enforce it at the same time. And if I don't have the computational tool to detect these things, well, what is the point of increasing k? So if You're just making a rule that makes you look good, but at the same time, it will not, you cannot enforce it. So the goal here is you want to be able to detect vulnerabilities of the power in the power network. But that's the first thing. So you don't want to be the grumpy guy who just finds faults in things. So here's what is wrong, and here's what is wrong with your system. You have to, well, fix them as well. How do I make decisions, well, in terms of planning for tomorrow? How do I make decisions now so that the system is secure at the first place? So these are the kinds of problems I want to work on. But why don't we just go ahead and do it? Well, the problem is that, well, it's a difficult problem. First, if I'm talking about the security of such an important infrastructure, I don't want to just sell for heuristics. You cannot just say, well, I think it's going to work. I don't see any problems with it. But you want to be able to just say, well, I did apply this analysis, and I'm sure the system will be secure with 99% confident. So you cannot just, well, settle down for heuristics. So that's that's one of the problems. Well, the other problem is, well, combinatorial complexity of the problem. Even if I just, well, look at the bare bones of the problem, just strip off everything, you're talking about an NP-hard problem. So that's a difficult problem to solve. And on top of that, we are looking at defender-attacker-defender games. So how do I design the system now? I'm the defender. And the bad guys will attack. Even if it's not an explicit attack, bad things will happen. And I'm not talking about random failures. It may be extremely unlikely events with very low likelihood. But if they do happen, even in that case, I should be able to defend, respond, and limit the damage. So whenever you have these defender-attacker problems, you have one optimization problem or something that looks for events at the tail ends inside another optimization problem, and these problems suddenly become extremely hard to solve. Well, I didn't say anything about the complexity of power flow. The way you describe power flow is through differential algebraic equations. Well, these are non-trivial problems, so they're hard to solve by themselves. And if you want to solve an optimization problem where you have differential algebraic equations as constraints, especially if you're solving discrete optimization problems, good luck with that. So that adds another level of complexity. Even if I ignore the dynamics in the system and the steady state, I'm facing nonlinear equations. And the last one is uncertainty in the system. Well, there's an inherent uncertainty in the system. So I can only predict how much I'll be generating through a renewable energy from wind or solar. And I can only predict how much load, well, how much I'll be consuming. And you are predicting with these, you're working with predictions, and then you want to be secure. Well, it's a difficult problem. You can admire it. You look at this and, oh, wow, this is a really difficult problem. But we're not in the business of admiring problems. We need to solve them. So how do you solve it? Well, practice, usually people just focus on one of these things and try to ignore the details of the others. And that makes sense because these are really, each box by itself is a challenge. And I'll try to do the same thing. Just make simplified. I cannot solve the whole problem. I have to make some assumptions so that I have a problem, difficult enough problem, but I have simple enough that I have a chance to solve. So by doing that, we should make those assumptions. That's how you do research. But at the same time, at least we should be cognizant of, well, we are making these assumptions. We cannot ignore them. We can make assumptions and come back and tie the loose end later. So for now, I will not, you cannot probably see this green dot, right? But there is one. So I'll ignore the uncertainty, and I will ignore the dynamics of the system and focus on steady state equations. So this is the difficult part. Well, this is the part we can't do. And this is, what else? Well, how about what we can do? So it's just on the positive side, what kinds of problems do we already know how to solve? So how many of you are familiar with Maxwell, mincut results? All right, so the more computer science people. So the idea here is I give you a graph, and I have a special vertex source and a special vertex, the sink or terminal. It's S and T here. And I have capacities on the lines, how much I can flow, I can push through that line. And the goal is start with S, that's where you're generating, and go to T, that's the sink, and you want to move as much flow as possible from the source to the terminal. And you see lines here, and those lines correspond. The first line is, well, in this example, it's a flow assignment. That means I'm sending 2 units of flow from S to this other node. And well, the other constraint is, of course, conservation of flow. You're not generating flow in the intermediate vertices. And the second number is here is the capacity. So here the solution can send 7 units of flow from the source to the terminal. That's the idea. A related concept is a cut. And a cut is bipartitioning. The idea of the cut is that I have the source on this part, on this region, and I have the terminal on the other side. So I'm drawing a line, source is here, terminal is here, and I say, I don't care what you do over on this side, and I don't care what you do over on this side, but the flow you can pass from one side of this line to the other side is an upper bound. So you cannot do any better than that, because whatever you do, source is here, terminal is here, it has to go through that line. So each cut will give you a capacity, and one of the fundamental results, earliest fundamental results in combinatorial algorithms, well, the minimum of all the cuts, the one with the minimum capacity is equal to the maximum flow in the graph. So even if you're not familiar with with its concept, you can just for now, well, I can assure that these are the kind of problems we can solve in computer science. And if I can somehow bring the problem to this, I'll be able to solve it. All right, so what else can we solve? So I'll add another complexity to this problem. Instead of the maximum problem, I have the bad guy in the loop now. And this person will pick lines and remove them from the system. And the goal is, after the lines are removed, the maximum flow in the resulting system will be minimized. So this is what we call the inhibition problem. You are inhibiting the functionality of the system. So you pick the minimum number of lines, or the dual problem, the similar problem is, so that the maximum flow is below a specified bound. It's an NP-complete problem, but we can solve these similar problems using integer programming. For now, so this source and terminal, I will remove them because it's just a matter of notation. You don't need to explicitly have them. So my red nodes will be my generators, and the blue nodes are my consumers. So these numbers, the minus means there's consumption on those nodes. And if I want to attack this system, the original system, without removing any lines, the maximum flow is 11. So if I remove one line, I would attack that line. And the green lines, by the way, they're the capacities. The max flow will be reduced to 7. If I remove another line, the max flow will be, well, down to 5. And if I can remove 3 lines, it's not an incremental thing. So I used to pick this line. I used to have this line, but I don't have that anymore. And the maximum flow will be 3. So yes, we can solve these problems, but at the same time, by only looking at this problem, the structure, combinatorial structure of the problem, it tells me what kind of techniques I can use. First, this is not an incremental thing. So usually for these problems, greedy techniques don't work. So if you're familiar with, this is the opposite of submodular functions. So if you always for the greedy solutions, you go for the low-hanging fruit, and you keep going for the, and if you increase capacity, you would go after the next low-hanging fruit and you keep going after the low-hanging fruits. You will never realize that, hey, I can afford a ladder now. I can go and buy a ladder, and I can pick up the best ones. So there's a big function in terms of payoff, in terms of, well, in submodular function for, if you want to use greedy algorithms, if you have diminishing returns, greedy algorithms work well. But this is just the opposite. So you will have big jumps in payoff as you increase your attack size, attack being the number of lines you can remove. So even if I don't use these techniques, even if I don't use this method, it's good to keep this in mind, understand this. And when I'm designing any other heuristic, I should be able to keep an eye on this. So that's why, well, like I said, graph models are useful. This is one reason graph models are useful. By just looking at this problem, I know where to look at when I'm using any other heuristics. For instance, use any other technique that captures the power flow much better. But keep an eye on this and see if you're getting trapped in the greedy solutions and if you're always going after the low-hanging fruit. All right, so I know I can solve this problem, but well, how useful is this? So that's the other part of this. Useful, graph models useful. The bad thing is, for instance, so how would you explain this to a power engineer? So what do you say? Yeah, you know that problem you told me about? Yes, I can't solve that problem, but there's another problem I can't solve. You know, that's, so what do you say? Good for you, you know, that's, so it's not exciting because I'm not solving the power system problem because the flow of power, unless I can describe the flow of electrical power within that model, it will be useless. So I'm just, so I can only entertain myself. On the good side, if you're a computer scientist, you can just at least say, hey, at least there's a problem that I can't solve instead of the others. So that's credible as well. So the good, the bad, and well, the beautiful part is that by looking at, as I said, I'm repeating what I said in the earlier slide, just understanding combinatorial structure, it helps me design better techniques, or at least I can know where the bottlenecks will, where I can run into problems. And in the rest of the talk, I will mention that, I describe that. Actually, the gap between the two models is not as wide as it looks. So it's much smaller, and I will actually start with the power flow equations, and I will drive this model by making, and along the way, I'll list all the assumptions I'll be making. All right, so I said the flow of power cannot be explained with that model. So what is the flow of power? I'll not use too many equations during the talk, but if you see them, you don't really need to understand them. I will just putting them that these are well-defined well-defined systems. So you don't really understand the equations. So for flow of power, the big important thing is that it's described by the potential difference between the nodes. In computer science, we have variables on the edges. In power flow, electric power flow, we have variables on the vertices. And we have one equation for conservation of flow for each node. That's n unknowns, n equations. You'll have a single result, or if you have multiple solutions, that's only because of nonlinearity. In computer science flows, we have edges, more edges than the nodes, so we have a space so to investigate for the maximum flow. It's a different problem. So we have voltages and phase angles on the nodes, and the flow is described here, the product of the voltages times sine of the angular difference. And then we want the conservation of flow that's into a node should be flow that's out of the node, plus, minus, whatever you're generating or consuming at that. And that's why we write these equations here. So A here describes my grid. It's a node arc incidence matrix. And the whole thing is I'm writing, these are the equations for conservation of flow. The flow into a node should be equal to flow out of the node. And P here describes the state of the system. That's how much I'm consuming and how much I'm generating at each node. And well, this is the whole topology of the grid is described by this matrix A. And I'll come back to that matrix. Again, without going into details, going into equations, well, I'll describe the blackout in a pictorial way. So this represents the point P, my operating point, how much I'm generating and how much I'm consuming. And this boundary represents my power flow boundary. And as long as you're inside that boundary, well, the power will flow from the generators to the consumer, so everything will be fine. But if you lose lines or if you lose generators from your power system, the feasibility region will shrink. So it will move on to here, and then you'll be infeasible. So that we'll only look at state here. And then, then the bad things will start. You're not interested in how bad the results are, but it's just bad, and this is something we want to exclude. So if you're talking about the optimization problem, the initial thing, finding vulnerabilities in the grid, what I'm trying to do is that, well, this was the original feasibility boundary, and I'll pick lines, a few lines or generators, that when I remove them, the system will be infeasible. The binary part of the problem, integer part of the problem is fixing the feasibility boundary. And then I'm looking at, well, I'll look at the distance to the feasibility boundary. That's what I'll need to do. OK, I'm infeasible now. I have to shed the loads. I'll just say, hey, you guys will not be receiving any power. So how much load I had to shed, how infeasible I am, that's my measure for severity of a blackout. We are interested in severe, that z vector be large enough, because otherwise you just unplug a lamp and hey, it's a blackout, right? So you're not interested in those cases. So that would be, I mean, conceptually a blackout, but we are only interested in very significant blackouts that would affect the whole system. So the binary mixed part, integer part of the problem is that choosing lines, a few lines out of many, and the continuous part of the problem is, which is nonlinear, is computing the distance from a given point to a nonlinear surface. So that's why we have a mixed integer nonlinear optimization problem. And for solving the problem, for the load shedding problem, this is computing this vector z. I will not solve it explicitly, but I'll replace that optimization problem with the necessary conditions for optimality, KKT conditions. And, well, we can only also prove that. I don't know if you want to know about the details of KK, whether I should be using KKT or not. Some of the constraint qualification conditions are satisfied. All right, so if you write this, the the equations, you have this nasty optimization problem. And I'll describe this for the rest of the talk. Okay. So you have a lot of the disjunctive constraints. So you cannot, well, you can relax this and try to solve a continuous problem, but there is an inherent discrete structure. So you're looking at the product of two things being 0. That's a disjunctive constraint, either or. Yes, please.
So this question about trying to find the shortest path, is that something that you'd always like to do? Are there ways of trying to distribute the load shedding so that it is geographically distributed? Are there aspects? Is it always the shortest path to load shedding? It might not be the optimal point that you want, but you want to satisfy some other constraints about being fair to a group of people that have already had load shedding in the past. I mean, there may be some other aspects that govern where you want to get to.
So for this formulation, for load shedding, actually, it's already too late. So if I lose those lines, so the dynamics of cascading will start, and we won't be able to shed the loads. But here, this is an approximation to how big the disturbance will be. For in practice, the way load shedding is used is, yes, you want to spread it peanut butter. And then there is the, well, not all loads are created equal. So you need to load hospitals or, well, transportation systems. We don't shed the loads for that. Usually the residential areas are shed. So, but for now, I'm interested in this. I'm not even interested in the vector z itself. I'm interested in the magnitude of that vector. All right, so it's a nasty problem. And, well, the formulation is I want to minimize the number of line cuts. And, well, here are, and again, I'm just using these, showing these equations to show that these are formulated.
About the load, so do you assume a specific form of the load, or it can be anything? It can be a linear, nonlinear load. Do you assume?
Right now, we're assuming a linear load for this formulation. All right, so we tried, let's solve the first thing. So this is how we wanted to model the problem. And of course, there are a lot of details of why we chose to work on this. And we tried to apply this, and we wanted to solve the relaxed problem. Instead of these binary variables, let's allow them to be anything between 0 and 1. And relaxation works on the small problem, and it identifies these 4 lines as the critical lines. And if you choose any 2, well, the system becomes infeasible. And I would have excess generation here, and then I cannot, well, which I cannot transfer to the upper side of the system. So it worked for this small problem, but if you apply this to a little bit bigger, the problem this is what you start getting. And the problem here is you just start removing a lot of lines because the optimizer cannot even find a feasible solution. So it starts ripping away lines just to find a feasible solution. By just look at the system, you can find better solutions yourself. So the relaxation does not work. But still, I have my formulation, and which I will use. Well, I think next is, so let's look at the formulation a little bit carefully and try to find its structure. So I think this is the critical slide for the most critical slide for the talk. So the key observation here is that if I look at this is the Jacobian of the power flow equations, and the critical thing here is, well, I have A transpose. This is the Northern incidence matrix. It's multiplied with A, and if you're familiar with spectral graph theory, that's the Laplacian, well, we've been working on. We know how to analyze the structure of that metric. So give me a graph, I turn it into a Laplacian, and I can tell a lot about from the eigenvalues of that matrix. What is in between is a bunch of diagonal matrices. B is, these are all constants, and this determines if I pick that line for removal or not. And if I remove it, that edge is canceled. Well, I put a weight, 0 weight on that. And this corresponds to the residual capacity of that line. And, well, the active flow is sine of A theta, and the cosine to me, it corresponds to residual. And there is a one-to-one correspondence to the power flow Jacobian that tells me about the nonlinear power flow. And it has the same structure of Laplacian in graph theory. And this correspondence helps me to understand, go from one side of the field, from the nonlinear equations to the graph theory, or from graph theory to the nonlinear equations. So once I have this correspondence, I know that will not get into the details here, but just I will try to explain everything at an intuitive level. On the boundary of feasibility, the power flow Jacobian will be, well, we'll have its second eigenvalue 0. It's the second 0 eigenvalue. And that's all possible if and only if, I'm going to the Laplacian now, your underlying graph has two disconnected components. And that's only possible by disconnected components. I'm assuming I start with a single connected power grid. That's only possible if there are two regions, and between these two regions, I either remove the line is cut, or this cosine A theta is 0. That's possible if the sine of the angular difference is pi over 2. I'm transferring power at its maximum capacity. So the residual flow capacity of the system becomes 0 at the feasibility of the solution. So I can look at the structure of the power grid, and at that point, in a feasible solution, the power system will be disconnected into two regions, and I will not be able to transfer power from one side to the other. So this is the correspondence between the nonlinear optimization or nonlinear formulations, and by looking at this correspondence, I can tell what happens at the network in terms of graph theory topological perspective. So this is another region. So this is exactly what we can prove about the system. At any feasible solution to this, to the problem I'm describing, the system will be split into two regions. One is load rich, and the other one is generation rich. Generation rich, it means I have excess power, and I don't know what to do with that. And load shedding, I can also tell that for the load shedding problem, if you're in the low to generation rich region, don't touch the loads. So that's what you need. Well, there you can feed them and only decrease the generation. And the opposite is true for the load rich region. By the way, give me any feasible region, feasible solution. I can point find these generation rich and load rich regions. I'm just looking at some of the multipliers. And then by looking at them, the lambda variables, if it's positive, you're on one side. If you're negative on the other, you're on the other side. So that's discretely described without, well, it's uniquely described. And I can also prove that there's at least one line that's saturated. So it's saturated meaning it's already operating in its maximum capacity. I cannot prove that once you get into the details of the formulation. I cannot prove that all lines will be saturated. That's why this formulation is imperfect. But that's my assumption. Then I can, well, I was promising that I would, along the way, list all the assumptions I'm making. And the corollary to this is that give me two regions, and if I'm interested in the size of the blackout, I'll look at how much excess generation I have in one part, and I will have I'll know how much I can transfer to the load-rich region, and whatever remains is what needs to be shed. That's described. This defines how much load I had to shed. So within this nonlinear problem, I can identify this combinatorial structure, and then if I know the solution has this combinatorial structure, why don't I just go look for it? So the problem is, if I rephrase what I've already said, is, well, I need to find minimum number of power lines whose removal composes the network into load-rich and generation-rich regions, such that the excess generation, I'll not read the rest, but this is what I've already said. And if I transfer them to the other computer science terminology, I'm trying to minimum number of edges whose removal leads to a cut. I was talking about the mean cut in the system. And now I have the generation-rich and load-rich regions. That's the one, well, I'm splitting into two regions, which has a source. One part has a source, and the other part is a terminal. That's exactly what a cut is. And the whole thing here corresponds to the capacity of the cut. So I can translate with this non-linear optimization problem into a combinatorial optimum problem. So what happened here? So am I just waving my hands and just say, hey, I started a non-linear optimization problem, and then I'm saying, oh, just don't worry about non-linearity. We'll just solve the graph problem, and I'll give you a solution. So you don't need to worry about non-linearity. So it's not a perfect model. And as I say, it's not free lunch, but well, this is it's a good deal that I'm turned, well, in difficult to solve problem into a much easier problem to solve. So the reason it works is that I've changed the problem a little bit. I don't tell you, for instance, there's accessing for. I don't have a power flow model. I don't tell you how the power is flowing. I can only tell you why it's not flowing. So that makes a difference. So, and I don't need to know how the power is flowing for my purposes. Second, it's a flow problem. Even though it's different, so there should be some correspondence. And the other part is that load shedding problem is actually, the goal of this is to make things work. So I want to shed as much load, the minimum volume of the load. And I can tell you, you have excess load or you have excess load on one side, excess load generation on the other side. I'm telling you to solve an optimization problem, and you have the capacity of the cut. So either you will shed it or you'll transfer it to the other side. And when you're solving this problem, of course, you are trying to match this lower bound on load shedding. So that what I'm giving you is a lower bound. And if you have an optimization problem, and especially if you're looking at significant blackouts that you have to shed like 10% of the load or 5% of the load, then you have a lot of freedom to make the approximation work. So what is missing is that, I know this worked on the examples we had, well, on a lot of cases we generated, but what is missing is that I would still like to be able to prove something about this model. And that's, instead of just saying it works in practice in all cases, and instead of, I can document the assumptions I'm making, but I still need more than that. We want to be able to quantify the gap and just say, well, I'm 99% confident the gap is less than, well, the error is less than 1%. The problem of why we cannot do that is that you can hand generate cases where this will not work, but that's not a typical power system. It will be more like cases, hey, I want to plug my TV right directly into the nuclear power plant because the view is more clear than that. So you won't have these cases in a typical power network. And initially, I was hoping that I would have a description of a typical power network so that I can, using that description, I would be able to bound the expectation that bound the expectation. But that's hard as well. But that didn't happen, and I don't think I have good enough models. And the next thing I want to try is that instead of a generic power flow model, I may be able to prove this on an instance of the power flows. After all, we don't have too many power grids around. So, you know, if I can look at the Western power grid and prove something, how good this approximation is in that case, so that would be good. That would be a strong result, and that's what I would like to do next. All right, so I already told you about the network inhibition problem. I'll try to speed up and tell you what else we do. So network inhibition problem, we know how to solve this thing. And in practice, well, I've not described the exact formulation, but if you're into optimization, the integrality gap for these problems are very small. So you can solve them, well, given the number of binary variables, you will be able to solve these things much faster than you would expect, or much faster than many other problems. And we can solve many instances in practice very rapidly. So the next problem is that, well, instead of finding an attack, if these problem is finding the regions in the graph with excess loads with a few connections is important. Can I make the problem even easier? And that's if I have two objectives. One is, well, the excess load in one region. The other thing is number of lines that connect that excess reach part to the rest of the graph. How do I find them? So if I can solve this problem too, I'm just showing you instances. And you can turn the problem into a Maxwell problem if you allow a trade-off parameter and iterate over alpha. And that allows me to work on analyze extremely large graphs, and that's in a matter of seconds. And what you see here is that this is how many lines I can cut, and this is how much of the load I can isolate by doing that. And what you see here is that initiating events is you're cutting a few lines that may cause a blackout. But what you see here in the middle part is the load corridors in the system. And these are really important for dynamics in a graph. So that's where the dynamics in the propagate. So it's more like how Southern California grid is connected to the Northern California power grid, and so on. And these are the parts where we have a lot of load flowing. All right, so I had to skip that part fast, but I want to say a few words about this too. All right, initially I was telling you I want to design systems, or I want to make decisions in the system so that, well, I don't have vulnerabilities in the first place. So the first level, I have, well, the first level of optimization is infrastructure augmentation. It may be I'm adding power lines to the system now, and which one am I adding to the system? Or if I want to build add a generator to the system, where should I locate it? So these are the kind of problems we want to solve at the higher level. And then once we do that, or if you're in daily operations, we are looking at how do I generate where do I generate the power now? And that's more unit commitment problem. And the bad things will happen. These may be adversarial, very smart attack, or it may be, well, events at with low probability. And then at the end, I will be solving a third level of optimization problem. And there I would be able to limit the damage. And while do you solve these problems? And each one, when I'm solving this upper level optimization problem, I have another optimization level problem that provides a constraint. So the way we solve these problems are, so first I come with an interesting idea. Hey, this is my design, so let's go with this. And the oracle, which finds vulnerabilities, it tells me, nope, if you do that, here's a risk, so your system will be vulnerable. Once I know that, I can take that, look at the structure of that, and use that as a constraint. Okay, so I change my master problem now, and I want to come up with a better design. So that doesn't have the vulnerability. And then I go to the oracle again. It's what is wrong with this? And then the oracle tells me what is wrong. And then each time I add another constraint to the system. And eventually, I'll have the unoptimal solution. And each time I'm narrowing the search space, making the systems more and more secure. The what makes this work or not is how you generate these, generate these constraints. So you want to generate constraints that does not exclude only one vulnerability, but a family of vulnerabilities at the same time. So we implemented this, for instance. What you see here is these are different systems. And the numbers you see here are, well, if I look at exclusively, if I look at all cases one by one, and I have 1,110 components here, I'm looking at removal of 4 components. So that's 1,100 choose 4. Instead of doing that, if I do it iteratively and excluding vulnerabilities one at a time, I'm only looking at iteration 900 times. That's instead of 63 billion times. So they're not fast, but if you're especially interested in transmission expansion, for instance, where should I build the new transmission lines? Well, you can easily afford to wait a few hours for these simulations to complete. And if you solve these problems efficiently, you can do analysis. Here, what you see is that, well, this is our analysis. How much, what percentage of loss of load I should allow. For instance, if I lose only 1 line, I don't want to lose any load. But if I lose 2 lines, maybe I can allow like 2% of the load to be shed. If I'm losing 4 lines, for instance, if I don't want to lose any power, so here is, well, the cost in billions, so like you're talking about 22 billion. But if I'm allowing a little bit, like 1% load shedding, you're cutting the infrastructure expansion costs by, well, 50%. And instead of, so here is, well, if I want to just spend, well, this is my budget, and how should I set my, well, allowable loss of load at different places? If in this case it tells me, yep, you should allow for k equals 4, if I lose 4 lines, why did you go ahead and allow 4% of the load to be shed? And that's how much the analysis allows me to set the expectations for these problems. All right, so I'm running out of time, so I want to leave time for questions. So in the beginning, I told you about why this problem was so hard and different things. And I told, okay, I'll ignore uncertainty, and I will ignore the dynamics in the system. But they are there. They are important. I mean, we can't ignore them. I'm only ignoring them because the current problem I had in hand was hard enough for me to solve. And now we have made some progress, and we understand the combinatorial problem. I think it's time for us to go back and tie these loose ends, and how do I bring uncertainty in the system. And uncertainty is, so it's being more and more important for power systems, and because that's mostly because of renewable generation. If you're a gas-based generator or, well, coal-based generator, well, you have the coal, you have the gas, and if you don't want more electricity, you ramp it up. Yeah, more electricity, and you generate it easily. At least it's something you can control. But if you need wind, well, what do? So it's more wind. You cannot just blow to these to turbines, and just make that turn faster. So that's, well, you can only predict how much you can generate from wind, and then you are, after the prediction, well, you can predict for tomorrow, and then once tomorrow comes, you are looking at a realization based on that prediction. It's the same thing for solar. So once you have these uncertainties, and with the limited technologies for storage, we cannot really store electricity yet at industrial level. And how do we make these solve these problems? And what we do here is, well, for the next day, for instance, you are connecting to some big generators. You guys will be active tomorrow, and then I think based on my predictions on demand, predictions of generation, I think I'll be able to satisfy the demand. But the next day, you pass your commitment decisions, and then you are facing, instead of the prediction, you are facing a realization of that demand. And how do you solve these problems? The standard approach in operations research is they don't call Monte Carlo sampling, but for stochastic optimization, they do solve Monte Carlo sampling. Monte Carlo sampling works if you don't want tight bounds on the error. But for security of the power grid, you cannot just say, I think the grid is secure will be secure with 5% probability, and my error is 10% plus or minus 10%. So you are looking at really low probability events anyway for security. Whenever you work with security, you want to focus on low probability events. And then using Monte Carlo sampling in that regime, it's not a good idea. So something we start doing is this polynomial chaos expansion. I'm working with the experts like Habib Najim and Kozmin Safdeh on this. So they are, I will not be able to explain you exactly how they solve these problems, but it's like they have the magic UQ dust on their pockets, and whenever we have a problem, you just sprinkle it and all out. They solve the problem. So here, what you see here is that for the same problem, what if you use Monte Carlo sampling? These large bars correspond to using Monte Carlo sampling, and there are, for each one, there's 1,000 experiments, each one using 100 samples, 1,000 samples, or so on. These white circles, they're the standard, they plot you the standard deviation. And the line here is what we can predict with polynomial chaos expansion. And it's normalized with respect to using, I think, a lot of Monte Carlo samples at the far end. And polynomial chaos expansion, it can capture the uncertainties extremely well, so it is working. But if you use these Monte Carlo sampling, you would need a lot of samples, and this will kill your, especially if you are looking at 10 to the 5 instances of the same problem, that will kill your performance, runtime performance. So this is something we started, and we want to do more of this. All right, so. The way I started talk was that essentially all the models are wrong, but some are useful. And my claim is that graph models are useful. And I hope I was able to convince you about that. So useful is, this graph models, the sentence graph models are useful. It's, first it says, yes, we have to use graph models, more of graph models. They are useful. But at the same time, it's a very reserved sentence. Useful is a very reserved word. So I will not claim that, we cannot use it, turn everything into a graph problem, solve it, and claim the problem is solved. We cannot do that, but at the same time, we should be, there is, for most of these cases, there is a use for the graph problems. In this case, even though the problem was nonlinear, I don't want to start with the graph model, imagine a graph model and use it. I can start with the nonlinear optimization problem and extract the combinatorial structure from that and use that model to solve my problem. So there is use for these graph models, but we have to be more careful in how we use them. And for vulnerability analysis, we have made a lot of advances, and right now we have a good idea about how to solve the problem for steady state. And now it's, the next thing was solving harder combinatorial problems, and we can solve them. Now we want to go back and just say, capture more of the power system, power-related properties. And we start with uncertainty. We haven't done anything for dynamics yet, and that's because, if anybody tells me here is a promising idea, I'll be very thrilled to think about that. I'll be very thrilled to work with you on that. We are not working on it just because we don't have a good idea yet, but it's an extremely important problem. And the next thing is we are looking at uncertainties, and I'm working with the right people who have a lot of expertise to handle uncertainties and engineering problems. And generally, Monte Carlo-based algorithms, if you're working on security, you're inherently working with low probability events, and Monte Carlo algorithms, unless you know that you can take many samples, whatever your problem is, for some cases it may be possible. Unless you know that you have many samples, Monte Carlo algorithms, I would be careful about using Monte Carlo algorithms. And with that, I think I would like to acknowledge I've worked with many different people. I had worked with interns over the years, and if you announced before stopping, I would like to tell you about the SciEM workshop on network science. We are trying to build a network science community under SciEM, and the deadline for submission is close by. And when you talk to people from national labs, they're always recruiting, you know. And if we want to make sure we are, even if you look at our website, even if you cannot find a good position for yourselves, feel free to email me. We try to make room for as much as possible for smart people who want to work on interesting problems. And if that's the case, please, well, if you are looking for interesting work in the national lab, please don't hesitate to contact me. And I have links to our publications here, and with that, I'll stop and take your questions.
We do have time for a couple of questions.
What kind of things do you have for your optimization? You said you don't compute the duality gap, right? So when you relax the problem, you compute the duality gap?
Relax the problem in the nonlinear case. We didn't compute. I don't remember. That's been a while when we looked at the duality gap. But overall, the approach it was not very promising, and we didn't go deeper into that. For using different solvers, you can achieve better results for nonlinear solvers, but there will be limits. I think the constraints, these disjunctive constraints, they'll be a problem sooner than later, I think.
And about one more, and about that you consider only linear loads, but I mean life has only nonlinear loads. I mean even the simplest load is nonlinear. So I mean how easy is to put this in practice if you consider only linear loads, and even if you linearize something, it might.
So what is a nonlinear load? Yes, but for most of the power, well, it is the transmission level.
Yeah.
So do we need to look at these, or well I don't know. But work with power engineers like I don't know, but Bernie last year. That's what he described the problem to me. I think I took his word to work with linear loads, and I will not be able to argue against you why we should take non-linear loads around. But So if you have problems, well, contact Bernie about the power system assumptions.
Other questions? Yeah.
When you talk about the number of cuts in system sensitivity breaks down to a low-rich generation region, is that always in two distinct, like continuous regions of like this whole active graph is low-rich? Part of the reason why I'm asking, I guess, is because that physically happens a lot with grid-level power, where say you have like a nuclear power plant, and then that is separated physically, not a problem. But when we get to the renewables, then people are suggesting that there might be, like solar panels distributed all throughout the city, generating power, that sort of thing. And is that change the problem, or?
I don't think it will change the problem. So I haven't explicitly checked if these were, well, two separate regions. One is connected by itself and the other is connected by itself. You may have multiple regions, but you will not have like, well, the middle part maybe and the two parts on the sides, maybe, well, two generation-rich regions that are not connected. But I don't think that would make a big difference for this model.
So actually, slightly related to that, design problem, so you can get alternatives and where you could add capacity and so forth. Or any sort of, general principles or anything that you can derive from this work that would, advise on general principles and policies for citing renewable power generation or something, or anything like that. Is there? Can you say things about, if the grid looked more like this than like this, then it would be less vulnerable.
Yes, and that's certainly. As long as you can generate close to your to the consumption, well, generation to be as close to the consumption as possible. But there are limits on how much limits on. For instance, even for wind generation, we cannot put these turbines arbitrarily. There are places that we can put them, and we don't have too much flexibility on how we locate. But overall, yes, that's exactly. Especially well, for storage, for instance, that's a bigger story. So, location of the storage, that may be more effective, and that may be easier. And it may help you predict some of the blackouts. And when we solve these design problems, actually, that's what we discover, and for most of the problems, yes.
More questions? Let's thank Ali again.